February 14th, 1929. Valentine's Day in Chicago. While couples across America exchanged chocolates and love letters, 7 men lay sprawled across a garage floor in pools of their own blood, their bodies riddled with machine gun fire. The only sounds echoing through the frigid warehouse were the distant rumble of elevated trains and the labored breathing of a German shepherd named Highball, whimpering beside his master's corpse. This wasn't a crime of passion between lovers scorned. This was business. Cold, calculated, and executed with military precision in the heart of America's most violent city during its most violent decade. The Clark Street garage looked like a slaughterhouse. Blood splattered the brick walls in grotesque patterns, creating a macabre Valentine that would forever stain Chicago's reputation. The victims weren't innocent bystanders caught in crossfire. They were soldiers in an invisible war that had been raging beneath the city's surface for years, a conflict fueled by illegal alcohol, unlimited greed, and the kind of ambition that could only end in death. At 10:30 that morning, neighbors heard what they thought were firecrackers celebrating the holiday. The rapid pop-pop-pop of automatic weapons fire barely registered in a neighborhood where such sounds had become as common as church bells. By the time curious onlookers peered through the garage windows, the killers had vanished into the maze of Chicago's streets, leaving behind a scene so brutal it would shock even the city's violence-hardened residents. The victims weren't randomly chosen. Each man lying on that concrete floor represented a carefully calculated move in a chess game where the stakes were control of Chicago's multi-million-dollar bootlegging empire. They were members of the North Side Gang, soldiers in an organization that had dared to challenge the most powerful criminal in American history, a man whose scars told stories of violence and whose smile promised death. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. What the killers couldn't have known was that their primary target, the man they'd orchestrated this elaborate execution to eliminate, wasn't even there. George Bugs Moran, the North Side Gang's volatile leader, was running late that morning, a delay that would save his life and ensure that the St. Valentine's Day massacre would become not the end of Chicago's gang war, but its bloodiest escalation. The massacre would send shockwaves through American society, forcing a nation to confront the monster that Prohibition had created. It would expose the corruption that rotted Chicago's government from the inside out and ultimately lead to one of the most famous criminal investigations in American history. But first, it would make Al Capone the most notorious gangster who ever lived. This is the story of how love's holiday became synonymous with hate, how 7 deaths in a garage changed the course of American law enforcement forever, and how the pursuit of the American dream through illegal means turned Chicago into a battlefield where the only law was the law of the gun. To understand the massacre, you must first understand Chicago in 1929, a city transformed into a criminal paradise by a single piece of legislation that would prove to be one of America's greatest policy disasters. The Volstead Act, passed in 1920 to enforce the 18th Amendment's prohibition of alcohol, hadn't eliminated drinking. Instead, it had created the most lucrative black market in human history, and nowhere was that market more ruthlessly exploited than in the city of big shoulders. Chicago's geography made it perfect for smuggling. Nestled between the Great Lakes and surrounded by rural counties where stills could operate in relative secrecy, the city became a natural hub for illegal alcohol distribution. Bootleggers could ship liquor by boat across Lake Michigan from Canada, truck it in from rural distilleries, or produce it in the hundreds of speakeasies that operated openly throughout the city. By 1929, Chicago boasted over 10,000 illegal drinking establishments, more than had existed legally before Prohibition. The money was staggering. A case of whiskey that cost $4 to produce illegally could sell for $60 on Chicago's streets. Beer that brewers had once sold for $5 a barrel now fetched $50. Conservative estimates put Chicago's annual bootlegging revenue at over $100 million, equivalent to nearly $2 billion today. This wasn't just crime. It was big business, complete with supply chains, distribution networks, and corporate hierarchies. But with such enormous profits came inevitable violence. Traditional criminal organizations found themselves overwhelmed by the scale and sophistication required to run Prohibition-era operations. Street gangs evolved into complex enterprises with hundreds of employees, fleet of trucks, networks of corrupt officials, and military-grade weapons. They divided Chicago into territories as formally as any legitimate corporation might divide market share, except their business disputes were settled with Tommy guns rather than lawyers. The city's political machine, already notorious for corruption, proved completely unable to resist the tidal wave of bootlegging money. Police officers earned $40 a week legally, but could make hundreds by looking the other way. Judges found their mortgage payments mysteriously covered by anonymous benefactors. City council members discovered envelopes full of cash in their desk drawers. Mayor William Big Bill Thompson openly bragged about making Chicago a wide-open town, while his administration collected millions in protection money from criminal organizations. By the mid-1920s, Chicago's gang wars had claimed over 400 lives. Newspapers began publishing daily body counts like sports scores. Citizens grew accustomed to the sound of machine gun fire echoing through their neighborhoods. Parents taught their children to recognize the difference between backfiring cars and automatic weapons. The city had become a war zone where the combatants wore expensive suits instead of uniforms. The violence wasn't random. It followed strict business logic. Territory meant money, and money meant survival. Gang leaders understood that reputation for ruthlessness was as valuable as actual firepower. A willingness to kill wasn't just a personality trait, it was a business requirement. The more brutal your methods, the less likely competitors were to challenge your operations. Into this environment stepped men who would have been successful entrepreneurs in any legal enterprise. They possessed the organizational skills, strategic thinking, and leadership abilities that built American industrial empires. They understood supply and demand, territorial expansion, employee loyalty, and customer service. The only difference was that their business model depended on violence, and their ultimate product was defying federal law. The North Side Gang controlled the affluent neighborhoods along Lake Michigan, where wealthy customers paid premium prices for quality imported liquor. The South Side Italian Syndicate, led by Johnny Torrio and his protege Al Capone, dominated the industrial areas and immigrant communities where volume mattered more than quality. Smaller gangs carved out niches in specific neighborhoods or specialized in particular aspects of the trade: hijacking, protection, or political corruption. These weren't the disorganized street thugs of popular imagination. They maintained sophisticated intelligence networks, employed accountants and lawyers, invested in legitimate businesses to launder money, and planned operations with military precision. They understood that sustainable criminal enterprises required the same elements as legitimate ones: reliable supply sources, efficient distribution, customer satisfaction, and elimination of competition. The stage was set for a conflict that would make previous gang wars look like playground disputes. The stakes were too high, the profits too enormous, and the players too ambitious for peaceful coexistence. Chicago had become a powder keg with a lit fuse, and everyone knew the explosion was coming. The only questions were when, where, and how many would die when it finally detonated. At opposite ends of Chicago's criminal spectrum stood two men whose hatred for each other would ultimately drench the city's streets in blood. They couldn't have been more different in background, temperament, or style, yet their mutual obsession with destroying the other would define the most violent chapter in American organized crime history. Alphonse Gabriel Capone arrived in Chicago in 1919 as a 20-year-old nobody from Brooklyn with 3 distinctive scars carved across his left cheek, souvenirs from a knife fight that had earned him the nickname Scarface, though few dared use it to his face. He possessed a brilliant criminal mind wrapped in the body of a street brawler, combining strategic thinking with explosive violence in ways that terrified even hardened gangsters. By 1925, Capone had transformed himself from Johnny Torrio's ambitious lieutenant into the undisputed emperor of Chicago's South Side, controlling an organization that employed over 1,000 people and generated revenues exceeding $50 million annually. Capone understood that successful crime required the same elements as legitimate business: customer service, employee loyalty, public relations, and elimination of competition. He dressed in custom-tailored suits that cost more than most workers earned in a year, tipped lavishly, donated to charities, and cultivated an image as a modern-day Robin Hood who simply gave people what they wanted. His Chicago outfit operated like a corporation, complete with departmental divisions, salary structures, pension plans, and employee benefits. But beneath the veneer of respectability lay a willingness to use violence that was both calculated and terrifying. George Clarence Bugs Moran represented everything Capone despised about Chicago's old guard gangsters. Born in Minnesota to Polish immigrants, Moran had earned his nickname through erratic behavior that made even his allies nervous. Where Capone was methodical, Moran was impulsive. Where Capone built alliances, Moran made enemies. Where Capone understood public relations, Moran reveled in his reputation as a psychopath who killed for pleasure as much as profit. The North Side gang that Moran inherited from the murdered Dean O'Banion in 1924 controlled Chicago's most lucrative territory, the wealthy neighborhoods along Lake Michigan, where customers paid premium prices for quality imported liquor. Moran's organization was smaller than Capone's, but fiercely independent, refusing to acknowledge the Italian syndicate's growing dominance over Chicago's underworld. This independence would prove to be both his greatest strength and his fatal weakness. The war between these criminal empires had been brewing since 1924, when O'Banion's murder triggered a cycle of revenge killings that claimed dozens of lives. Each assassination demanded retaliation. Every act of violence required an even more brutal response. The conflict escalated from individual murders to coordinated attacks involving multiple gunmen and military-grade weapons. By 1929, both organizations were spending more money on ammunition than most legitimate businesses spent on inventory. Territory drove their mutual hatred, but personal animosity fueled it. Capone viewed Moran as an unstable amateur who endangered the entire bootlegging industry through reckless violence and public spectacle. Moran saw Capone as an arrogant outsider who didn't understand Chicago's criminal traditions and threatened the independence of established gangs. Their philosophical differences about how organized crime should operate made compromise impossible. The breaking point came in 1928 when Moran's gunmen hijacked several truckloads of Capone liquor worth over $50,000. Rather than simply stealing the alcohol, they machine-gunned the trucks and left the wreckage in the middle of State Street as a public insult. Capone's reputation for invincibility suffered, and other gangs began questioning whether his organization was as powerful as advertised. Capone understood that allowing such disrespect to go unpunished would invite challenges from every ambitious criminal in Chicago. He needed to send a message that would eliminate the North Side Gang as an effective organization while demonstrating to the entire underworld that crossing Al Capone meant death. The message needed to be so brutal, so complete, and so public that no one would ever again question his authority. By early 1929, intelligence networks on both sides reported that something unprecedented was being planned. The level of violence that had already claimed hundreds of lives was about to escalate beyond anything Chicago had ever witnessed. Both men understood that their war could only end with the complete destruction of the other. Neither could have predicted that their hatred would produce the most notorious mass murder in American criminal history. The plan that would become the St. Valentine's Day Massacre began forming in Al Capone's mind during the winter of 1928, but its execution required months of meticulous preparation that demonstrated the sophisticated intelligence operations both gangs maintained. This wasn't going to be another drive-by shooting or restaurant ambush. Capone wanted to eliminate the entire North Side Gang leadership in a single, devastating blow that would end their organization forever. The key to the plot was exploiting Bugs Moran's greatest weakness, his greed. Despite controlling lucrative territory, Moran's unpredictable behavior had strained relationships with Canadian suppliers who preferred dealing with more reliable partners. Capone's organization learned through their network of informants that the North Side Gang was desperately seeking new sources of high-quality liquor to maintain their premium market position. Jack McGurn, Capone's most trusted enforcer and strategic planner, developed an elaborate deception that would lure Moran and his top lieutenants to a single location where they could be eliminated simultaneously. The plan involved creating a fictional liquor deal too attractive for Moran to resist, a shipment of premium Canadian whiskey at below-market prices, supposedly hijacked from a rival gang and available for immediate purchase. The setup required insider knowledge of North Side gang operations that could only have come from someone within Moran's organization. Historical evidence suggests that someone close to Moran, possibly even one of his trusted lieutenants, had been secretly feeding information to Capone for months. This betrayal wasn't motivated solely by money. Several North Side gang members had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Moran's erratic leadership and saw Capone's more structured organization as a better long-term prospect. The fake liquor deal was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. on February 14th at SMC Cartage Company, a garage at 2122 North Clark Street that served as a North Side gang meeting place and warehouse. The location was perfect for Capone's purposes, isolated enough to prevent immediate police response, but accessible enough that his gunmen could arrive and escape without attracting attention. The early morning timing ensured that most legitimate businesses in the area wouldn't yet be fully operational. McGurn's plan called for 4 gunmen disguised as police officers to enter the garage and order the North Side gang members to line up against the wall for what appeared to be a routine police raid. This disguise served multiple purposes. It would prevent the victims from immediately reaching for weapons, ensure their compliance with orders, and provide the killers with enough time to position everyone for maximum efficiency. The fake police uniforms also meant that any witnesses would initially report a law enforcement action rather than a gang killing. The psychological element of the plan was particularly cruel. Moran's men had survived numerous attempts on their lives by remaining constantly vigilant and heavily armed. But police raids, while annoying and expensive, weren't typically fatal. Gang members understood that corrupt cops could be bribed, legitimate arrests could be beaten in court, and even prison sentences were preferable to coffins. The fake police uniforms would trigger compliance rather than resistance. 2 additional gunmen would remain outside in a Cadillac, dressed as detectives, to ensure that no North Side gang members escaped and to provide security for the uniformed killers inside. The entire operation was designed to last less than 10 minutes from arrival to departure, minimizing the risk of genuine police intervention or civilian interference. The weapons chosen for the massacre reflected both the plan's military precision and Capone's desire to send an unmistakable message. Thompson's submachine guns, Tommy guns, had become the weapon of choice for gang warfare because of their devastating effectiveness at close range. Each gun could fire over 600 rounds per minute, ensuring that even professional killers accustomed to violence would be dead before they could react. On February 13th, the day before the planned massacre, Moran received final confirmation of the liquor deal through his informant network. The price was indeed too good to refuse. Premium Canadian whiskey at $30 per case, when the normal market price was $50. The supposed seller claimed urgency because police pressure was forcing him to move the inventory quickly. Moran scheduled the meeting for 10:30 the following morning and instructed his top lieutenants to attend. He had no way of knowing that every detail of the conversation was being reported to McGurn within hours. The trap was set, the killers were positioned, and the most notorious mass murder in American criminal history was less than 24 hours away. At 10:25 a.m. on February 14th, 1929, a black Cadillac touring car pulled up to the SMC Cartage Company garage at 2122 North Clark Street. The temperature hovered near zero, and fresh snow crunched under the wheels as 4 men emerged from the vehicle. 2 wore Chicago Police Department uniforms complete with badges, winter coats, and service revolvers. The other 2 dressed like detectives in long overcoats and fedoras. To any observer, this appeared to be a routine police raid on a known gang hangout. Inside the garage, 7 men waited in various states of readiness for what they believed would be a lucrative business transaction. The North Side gang had assembled their most trusted members for this deal. Frank and Pete Gussenberg, brothers whose loyalty to Moran was absolute. James Clark, Moran's brother-in-law and second-in-command. Adam Heyer, the gang's accountant and business manager. Alwine Shank, who managed their cleaning and dyeing operations as a front business. Johnny May, a mechanic who maintained the gang's fleet of vehicles. And Reinhard Schwimmer, an optometrist who associated with Gangsters for the thrill but had no criminal role. The garage itself was a typical industrial space. Concrete floors, brick walls, high ceilings with exposed beams, and large windows that provided natural light. Vehicles in various states of repair occupied most of the floor space, along with tools, spare parts, and legitimate business equipment that provided cover for the gang's illegal operations. The smell of motor oil and gasoline hung heavy in the cold air. At exactly 10:30, the uniformed men entered through the front entrance while the plainclothes officers remained outside. Police. Everyone against the wall. The command was delivered with the authority that genuine Chicago cops used during routine raids. The 7 men inside reacted exactly as McGurn had predicted, with resignation rather than resistance. Gang members understood that police raids were temporary inconveniences that money could usually resolve. The victims lined up against the north wall of the garage, facing the cold brick with their hands raised. This positioning was crucial to the killer's plan. It prevented the victims from seeing their executioners clearly and ensured that the massive firepower about to be unleashed would be concentrated in a confined space. Frank Gussenberg, the most experienced gunman among the victims, may have sensed something wrong in those final moments, but by then it was far too late. What happened next lasted approximately 90 seconds, but would be remembered for decades as the most brutal example of gang warfare in American history. The fake police officers drew Thompson submachine guns that had been concealed beneath their winter coats and opened fire at point-blank range. The .45 caliber bullets traveled at over 800 feet per second, each one capable of tearing through human tissue with devastating effect. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a continuous roar of automatic weapons fire punctuated by the metallic clatter of spent shell casings hitting the concrete floor. The muzzle flashes illuminated the garage in strobing bursts of white light. Gunpowder smoke filled the air, creating a choking haze that reduced visibility to mere feet. The killers fired with methodical precision, sweeping their weapons back and forth to ensure that every target was hit multiple times. Over 70 rounds were expended in those 90 seconds. The victims had no opportunity to return fire, seek cover, or even cry out warnings. Most died instantly from massive trauma to vital organs. The few who survived the initial barrage were finished off with additional bursts of gunfire. Frank Gussenberg, despite being shot 14 times, somehow remained conscious when the shooting stopped. The killers checked each body to ensure their work was complete, then prepared to leave. But their carefully orchestrated plan required one final theatrical touch. The plainclothes officers outside entered the garage and emerged moments later with their hands raised, as if they were being arrested by the uniformed men. This performance was intended for any witnesses who might be watching from nearby buildings. The entire operation lasted exactly 7 minutes from the Cadillac's arrival to its departure. By 10:37 a.m., the killers had vanished into Chicago's maze of streets, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would shock even the violence-hardened residents of America's most dangerous city. 7 men lay dead or dying in pools of blood, their bodies twisted in the unnatural positions that only high-velocity gunfire could create. The only survivor was Highball, Johnny May's German shepherd, who had been chained near his master and was now whimpering beside the corpse, covered in blood but physically unharmed. The first person to discover the massacre was Elmer Lewis, a boarding house operator who lived across the street from the SMC Cartage Company. At approximately 10:45 a.m., Lewis heard Highball's continuous howling and barking echoing from the garage, a sound so desperate and mournful that it cut through the ambient noise of Chicago's industrial north side like a siren. Lewis initially dismissed the dog's distress, assuming Johnny May was simply working on a particularly difficult automotive repair. But as minutes passed and Highball's cries grew more frantic, curiosity overcame indifference. Lewis crossed Clark Street and peered through one of the garage's frost-covered windows. What he saw through that glass would haunt him for the rest of his life. 7 bodies lay sprawled across the concrete floor in pools of blood that had already begun to congeal in the February cold. The metallic smell of blood mixed with gunpowder residue created an acrid atmosphere that made Lewis gag. Shell casings scattered across the floor reflected the pale winter light streaming through the windows. The brick wall where the victims had been lined up was pockmarked with bullet holes and splattered with blood in patterns that told the story of those final 90 seconds. Lewis stumbled backward from the window, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. This wasn't his first encounter with gang violence. No longtime Chicago resident could claim such innocence by 1929, but the sheer scale of the carnage was unprecedented. Even in a city where multiple murders had become routine, the systematic execution of 7 men represented an escalation that crossed into new territory. The police response revealed everything wrong with Chicago's law enforcement system. Lewis's emergency call reached the Hudson Avenue station at 10:52 a.m., but the first patrol car didn't arrive at the scene until 11:15. This delay wasn't due to distance or traffic. The station was less than 2 miles away. Instead, it reflected the casual attitude that police had developed toward gang violence. Dead criminals weren't considered urgent police business. Detective Sergeants Thomas Loftus and John McFadden were the first officers to enter the garage. Both were 20-year veterans who had witnessed hundreds of violent crime scenes. Yet what they found at SMC Cartage Company left them visibly shaken. McFadden later told reporters that the massacre looked like a slaughterhouse and represented the work of professionals who wanted to make sure nobody survived. Incredibly, Frank Gussenberg was still alive when police arrived. Despite having been shot 14 times, including wounds to his chest, abdomen, and legs, the 36-year-old gunman remained conscious and defiant. When Detective Loftus knelt beside him and asked who had done this, Gussenberg's response embodied the criminal code that governed Chicago's underworld. "I'm not going to talk. Nobody shot me." Gussenberg's refusal to cooperate wasn't surprising, but his physical condition was miraculous. Doctors who examined him at Election Brothers Hospital couldn't explain how a man with such massive internal injuries remained conscious, much less coherent. His silence wasn't just criminal loyalty. It was a final act of defiance against the men who had destroyed his organization. He died 3 hours later without revealing a single detail about the massacre. News of the killings spread through Chicago with unprecedented speed. By noon, crowds had gathered outside the Clark Street garage despite police efforts to secure the scene. Reporters from every newspaper in the city converged on North Clark Street, accompanied by photographers whose flash bulbs illuminated the carnage in stark black and white images that would appear on front pages across America. The Chicago Tribune's afternoon edition carried the headline, "7 Slain by Gangland Firing Squad," in letters so large they could be read from across the street. The Chicago Daily News described the scene as wholesale murder and called for immediate federal intervention. Even newspapers that typically downplayed gang violence treated the massacre as front-page news that demanded public attention. But beneath the sensational headlines lay a more troubling reality. Nobody was talking. The wall of silence that protected Chicago's criminal organizations had never been more impenetrable. Witnesses who might have seen the killers arrive or depart suddenly developed amnesia. Informants who usually traded information for money or protection claimed complete ignorance. Even routine sources of intelligence went quiet. This silence wasn't just fear. It was recognition that the massacre had changed the rules of engagement in Chicago's underworld. The systematic execution of 7 men demonstrated a level of organization and ruthlessness that made previous gang violence look amateurish. Anyone considering cooperation with police had to weigh the potential consequences against the demonstrated fate of Capone's enemies. The city's reaction was a mixture of shock, fascination, and resignation. Chicago had become accustomed to gang violence, but the St. Valentine's Day massacre crossed a line that even violence-hardened residents found disturbing. Commissioner of Police William F. Russell faced an unprecedented crisis on the afternoon of February 14, 1929. The St. Valentine's Day massacre hadn't just claimed 7 lives. It had exposed the complete failure of Chicago's law enforcement system to the entire nation. Newspaper headlines from New York to Los Angeles proclaimed Chicago a gangster capital, where criminals operated with impunity while police stood helplessly aside. Russell understood that his department's reputation, his own career, and possibly the future of legitimate government in Chicago hung in the balance. The massacre had attracted attention from Washington, where federal officials were already questioning whether local authorities could handle organized crime. The last thing Russell needed was federal intervention that would expose the extensive corruption within his own ranks. The investigation began with a crime scene that had been thoroughly contaminated by curious onlookers, reporters, and even souvenir hunters who had somehow breached police barriers. By the time detectives attempted to gather physical evidence, dozens of people had trampled through the garage, moving shell casings, disturbing blood pools, and destroying potential fingerprints. The brick wall where the victims had been executed was already being chipped away by morbid collectors seeking pieces of Chicago's most notorious crime scene. Detective Chief John Steege took personal command of the investigation, assembling a task force of 20 detectives who were supposedly clean of gang corruption. But in Chicago's police department, finding 20 officers who hadn't been compromised by bootlegging money was like finding 20 honest politicians. Theoretically possible, but practically unlikely. Several detectives assigned to the case had previously received payments from both the Capone organization and the North Side Gang. The physical evidence told a clear story even without expert analysis. Over 70 spent shell casings scattered across the garage floor came from Thompson submachine guns, military-grade weapons that weren't available through legitimate channels. The bullet patterns in the brick wall indicated that at least 2 shooters had fired simultaneously from slightly different angles, suggesting coordinated execution rather than spontaneous violence. More revealing were the weapons themselves, which the killers had apparently taken with them despite the risk of being caught with evidence. Professional criminals typically abandon murder weapons immediately after use, but these guns were too valuable and too difficult to replace. This suggested that the massacre had been carried out by an organization with sufficient resources and sophistication to maintain an arsenal of automatic weapons. The fake police uniforms presented the most intriguing clue. Authentic Chicago Police Department winter coats, badges, and equipment weren't available through normal criminal channels. Someone with access to official police supplies had either stolen the uniforms or provided them willingly. This pointed to corruption within the department itself, a possibility that Russell couldn't publicly acknowledge without admitting that his own officers might have facilitated the massacre. Witness interviews proved frustratingly unproductive. Despite the massacre occurring in broad daylight on a busy street, investigators found virtually no one willing to provide useful information. Mrs. Josephine Moran, who operated a boarding house directly across from the garage, claimed she had been in her basement doing laundry and heard nothing unusual. Her story was obviously false. The sound of Thompson submachine guns firing over 70 rounds would have been audible for blocks, but she refused to modify her statement even under intense questioning. Other neighbors provided similarly useless testimonies. They had seen nothing, heard nothing, and knew nothing about the 4 men who had arrived in the black Cadillac. This wall of silence wasn't just fear of gang retaliation. It reflected a community that had learned not to trust police with sensitive information. Too many witnesses in previous cases had found their names leaked to criminal organizations by corrupt officers. The investigation did produce one significant break when detectives discovered that someone had made several telephone calls to the SMC Cartage Company on the morning of February 13th, apparently confirming details about the fictional liquor deal. The calls had originated from a pay phone near Capone's headquarters at the Lexington Hotel, but phone records couldn't identify the specific caller. This evidence suggested that the massacre had been planned with inside knowledge of North Side Gang operations. Someone within Moran's organization had provided detailed information about the gang's meeting places, security procedures, and decision-making processes. The betrayal had come from within, making the crime even more devastating to the survivors. Russell faced enormous pressure to produce quick arrests. Mayor Thompson demanded immediate results to deflect criticism of his administration's cozy relationship with organized crime. Newspaper editorials called for mass arrests of known gangsters. Federal officials hinted that they might intervene if local authorities proved incompetent. But Russell's detectives were investigating a crime committed by professionals who understood police procedures better than most officers. The killers had left virtually no physical evidence, eliminated all witnesses, and created multiple false leads designed to waste investigative resources. They had planned not just a mass murder, but a perfect crime. As February gave way to March, Detective Chief John Steege's investigation began following leads that seemed to multiply like shadows in a hall of mirrors. Every promising clue led to another dead end. Every witness interview produced more questions than answers, and every arrest yielded nothing but expensive lawyers and alibis that couldn't be broken. The killers had vanished into Chicago's underworld as completely as if they had never existed. The first major break came from an unexpected source: ballistics analysis, a forensic science still in its infancy, but rapidly gaining credibility in criminal investigations. Detective Sergeant Frank Boyd, one of the few honest cops assigned to the case, had carefully collected every shell casing from the garage floor and arranged for comparison testing with bullets recovered from previous gang murders. The results were startling. The same Thompson submachine guns used in the St. Valentine's Day massacre had been employed in at least 5 other killings over the previous 18 months, including the murder of Frankie Yale in New York and several Chicago gang executions. This wasn't random violence. It was the signature work of professional killers who traveled between cities carrying out contracts for the highest bidder. Even more revealing was the discovery that these particular weapons had been stolen from a National Guard armory in Pennsylvania 2 years earlier. Military records showed that the theft had been carried out by men wearing authentic police uniforms who had convinced the Guard that they were conducting a legitimate inspection. The parallels to the massacre's execution were unmistakable. The same organization had been planning and executing sophisticated operations for years. The investigation then focused on identifying the 4 men who had entered the garage that morning. Witnesses, despite their public silence, had provided police with general descriptions through private channels. 2 of the killers were described as tall and thin, while the other 2 were shorter and stockier. All 4 had moved with the disciplined coordination of men accustomed to working together under pressure. Stege's detectives developed a list of potential suspects based on known associates of Jack McGurn, Al Capone's chief enforcer and strategic planner. The list included Fred "Killer" Burke, a machine gun specialist from St. Louis, John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, Capone torpedoes known for their loyalty and precision, and several other professional gunmen who worked for the Chicago outfit. But investigating Capone's organization proved nearly impossible. The crime boss had learned from previous legal troubles to insulate himself from direct involvement in violent operations. Multiple layers of intermediaries separated Capone from the actual killers, creating a buffer zone that legitimate investigators couldn't penetrate without inside cooperation. The most frustrating aspect of the investigation was the certainty that dozens of people knew exactly who had committed the massacre. Bartenders in Capone-controlled speakeasies had overheard drunken boasts about the killings. Prostitutes had listened to clients describe the operation in intimate detail. Low-level gang members had witnessed preparations for the attack. But the code of silence that governed Chicago's underworld remained absolute. Police tried various strategies to break this silence. They offered rewards for information, threatened known criminals with prosecution on unrelated charges, and even staged fake arrests designed to make informants appear to be victims rather than willing cooperators. Nothing worked. The massacre had so thoroughly terrorized Chicago's criminal community that even hardened gangsters refused to risk Capone's wrath by talking to police. The investigation received unexpected assistance from an unlikely source, Bugs Moran himself. Despite his reputation for instability, Moran provided detectives with detailed information about the fake liquor deal that had lured his men to their deaths. He identified the intermediaries who had arranged the meeting and described conversations that proved the massacre had been planned weeks in advance. Moran's cooperation wasn't motivated by civic duty or desire for justice. He understood that the massacre had effectively destroyed his organization as a viable criminal enterprise. Most of his remaining gunmen had fled Chicago immediately after February 14th, fearing that they would be the next targets. His bootlegging operations had collapsed without experienced leadership. His territory was being absorbed by rival gangs who sensed weakness. The North Side gang leader also revealed that someone within his organization had been feeding information to Capone for months before the massacre. Phone conversations had been repeated word for word to enemies. Meeting locations had become known to rival gangs within hours of being selected. Security procedures had been compromised in ways that could only have come from intimate knowledge of the gang's operations. But Moran couldn't identify the traitor, and his suspicions focused on men who were now dead. The massacre had eliminated not just his leadership, but also the witnesses who might have exposed the conspiracy that made it possible. By the summer of 1929, public pressure for arrests in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre had reached a crescendo that threatened to topple Chicago's entire political structure. Newspaper editorials demanded action with headlines like, "Capone laughs while Chicago bleeds," and "When will the killing stop?" Federal officials in Washington made increasingly pointed remarks about the competency of local law enforcement. Mayor Thompson's re-election prospects hung by a thread as voters began to question whether city government could protect its own citizens. The first significant arrest came on May 7th when police captured Fred "Killer" Burke following a high-speed chase through suburban Detroit. Burke, a machine gun specialist with connections to the Capone organization, had been identified by witnesses as one of the men seen near the Clark Street garage on the morning of February 14th. His capture seemed to offer the breakthrough that investigators desperately needed. But Burke's arrest quickly demonstrated the fundamental problems plaguing the investigation. Despite being caught with weapons matching those used in the massacre, Burke maintained absolute silence about the killings. His expensive legal team, funded by sources that prosecutors couldn't trace, challenged every piece of evidence and filed motion after motion to delay proceedings. Most damaging to the prosecution's case, Burke had an alibi that placed him in St. Louis on February 14th, an alibi supported by multiple witnesses whose credibility couldn't be effectively challenged. The Burke case revealed a truth that law enforcement officials were reluctant to acknowledge publicly. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre had been carried out by professionals who understood the legal system as well as they understood violence. Every aspect of the operation had been planned to minimize the risk of successful prosecution. The killers had alibis, the witnesses had been silenced or eliminated, and the physical evidence had been carefully managed to prevent conclusive identification. More arrests followed throughout 1929 and 1930, but each one followed the same pattern. John Scalise and Albert Anselmi, two Capone gunmen with reputations for precision killing, were charged with murder in connection with the massacre. Both men had solid alibis placing them at a wedding in Chicago's Little Italy at the time of the killings. Alibis supported by dozens of witnesses, including several Catholic priests and a photographer whose pictures documented their presence. The investigation faced an additional obstacle when it became clear that several key witnesses had been systematically eliminated. 3 men who had provided initial statements to police were found dead within 6 months of the massacre, all killed in circumstances that appeared unrelated to the case, but followed patterns consistent with professional executions. The message was clear: cooperation with authorities was a death sentence. Jack McGurn, the man investigators believed had planned the entire operation, proved to be the most elusive target of all. McGurn had spent February 14th at the Stevens Hotel with his girlfriend, Louise Rolfe, in a suite registered under his real name. Hotel records showed room service deliveries, telephone calls, and other activities that provided minute-by-minute documentation of his presence. The alibi was so perfect that prosecutors suspected it had been carefully constructed, but they couldn't prove fabrication. The federal government's entry into the case brought new resources, but also new frustrations. Treasury agents led by Elliot Ness began investigating the financial aspects of Chicago's gang wars, hoping to build tax evasion cases against criminal leaders who seemed immune to prosecution for violent crimes. This approach would eventually prove successful against Capone himself, but it offered no immediate justice for the massacre victims. State's Attorney John Swanson faced an impossible situation. Public demands for prosecution conflicted with the reality that his office lacked sufficient evidence to secure convictions against the actual killers. Grand juries heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, but consistently failed to return indictments that would survive legal challenges. The few indictments that were issued fell apart when key witnesses recanted their statements or simply disappeared. The investigation's failure reflected broader problems with law enforcement in Prohibition-era America. Local police departments were overwhelmed by the sophistication and resources of organized crime. Prosecutors struggled with witness intimidation, jury tampering, and judicial corruption. Federal agencies lacked the authority and coordination necessary to combat interstate criminal enterprises. By 1931, 2 years after the massacre, no one had been successfully prosecuted for the murders. The case files contained thousands of pages of testimony, hundreds of photographs, and detailed analyses of physical evidence. But this mountain of investigation had produced no convictions. Justice for the 7 victims seemed as elusive as the killers who had executed them with such methodical precision. The failure to solve the St. Valentine's Day Massacre sent a clear message throughout America's criminal underworld. Even the most notorious mass murder in history could go unpunished if it was planned and executed by professionals who understood the system's weaknesses. The failure to bring anyone to justice for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre marked a turning point in American law enforcement that would reshape how the nation fought organized crime. The 7 bodies in that Clark Street garage had become more than victims of gang warfare. They were symbols of a criminal justice system that had been systematically corrupted and overwhelmed by forces it couldn't comprehend or control. Within months of the massacre, federal authorities began developing new strategies that would transform American policing forever. The Bureau of Investigation, predecessor to the FBI, received unprecedented funding and authority to combat interstate criminal enterprises. Director J. Edgar Hoover used the public outrage over Chicago's gang violence to argue for expanded federal powers that had previously been considered unconstitutional. The massacre had proven that local authorities couldn't handle sophisticated criminal organizations that operated across state lines. The most immediate change came in forensic science. The ballistics evidence that had connected the massacre weapons to other crimes demonstrated the potential for scientific investigation techniques that could overcome witness intimidation and judicial corruption. Police departments across America began investing in crime laboratories, fingerprint analysis, and other technologies that promised objective evidence independent of human testimony. More significantly, the massacre accelerated the national conversation about Prohibition itself. The violence that had claimed hundreds of lives in Chicago alone forced Americans to confront the unintended consequences of the Volstead Act. Editorial writers who had previously supported Prohibition began questioning whether the policy was worth the social costs it had created. Religious leaders who had championed temperance found themselves defending a law that seemed to generate more sin than it prevented. Al Capone's reaction to the massacre's aftermath revealed both his strategic brilliance and his fundamental misunderstanding of American society. Rather than maintaining a low profile, Capone began courting publicity as never before. He gave interviews to national magazines, posed for photographs with celebrities, and cultivated an image as a businessman who simply provided services that customers wanted. This public relations campaign backfired spectacularly by making him the most recognizable criminal in America at precisely the moment when federal authorities were seeking high-profile targets. The massacre also marked the beginning of the end for Chicago's golden age of organized crime. The level of violence that had shocked even violence-hardened residents forced political changes that criminal organizations couldn't survive. Reform candidates won elections by promising to clean up the police department. Business leaders who had previously tolerated gang activity as a cost of doing business began demanding action. The tourist industry, crucial to Chicago's economy, suffered as visitors stayed away from a city they perceived as a war zone. Bugs Moran, the massacre's intended target, never recovered from the destruction of his organization. Within 2 years, he had been reduced to small-time operations that barely supported his remaining loyalists. His attempt to rebuild the North Side gang failed when potential recruits chose to work for more stable criminal enterprises. By 1935, Moran had been arrested for a bank robbery that netted less than $1,000, a pathetic end for a man who had once controlled millions in bootlegging revenues. The massacre's impact extended far beyond Chicago's criminal underworld. Newspaper coverage of the killings introduced Americans to the reality of organized crime in ways that abstract discussions of bootlegging never could. The image of 7 men executed against a garage wall became a symbol of Prohibition's failure that resonated with voters who had previously supported the policy. Public opinion polls showed dramatic shifts in attitudes toward alcohol regulation following the massacre. Hollywood's response to the massacre helped create the gangster film genre that would dominate American cinema throughout the 1930s. Movies like The Public Enemy and Scarface drew directly from the events of February 14, 1929, translating the violence and corruption of Chicago's gang wars into entertainment that both horrified and fascinated audiences. These films helped establish the cultural mythology surrounding organized crime that persists to this day. The legal precedents established during the failed Massacre investigation would prove crucial to later successes against organized crime. Prosecutors learned valuable lessons about the importance of financial evidence, the limitations of witness testimony, and the need for federal coordination in complex cases. The tax evasion conviction that finally sent Al Capone to prison in 1931 built directly on investigative techniques developed during the Massacre probe. Perhaps most importantly, the Massacre demonstrated that organized crime posed a threat to democratic institutions themselves. The corruption that had allowed criminal organizations to operate with impunity in Chicago existed in cities across America. The systematic intimidation of witnesses, corruption of officials, and subversion of legal processes represented challenges to the rule of law that demanded federal response. What's your take on this case? How did 7 deaths in a Chicago garage ultimately transform American law enforcement and hasten the end of Prohibition? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking.